everyone, I'm Xing-Yi. I'm 16 years old and I'm from Singapore. I'm very honored to have been given the valuable opportunity to speak at Polyglot Conference Global regarding Singlish, Singapore's very own creole language of English. Today, I'll be talking a little bit more about the developmental stages as well as history of Singlish. Please sit back, relax, and I hope that you enjoy my presentation. To begin with, you may find me on social media. As a Singaporean polyglot, extremely interested in communication and connecting with others of similar passions and interests, I have learned up to 11 languages till today. To reduce the obstacles that Singaporeans might have on their journey of language learning, financial or otherwise, and to bring like-minded individuals together to form a language learning community, I have founded Polyglot Club SG, Singapore's first polyglot club. You may find me on social media at my Instagram, Polyglot Club SG, or website, polyglotclubsg.com. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about Singlish or otherwise. So firstly, I'm sure we're all concerned with this question. What is Singlish after all? Well, Singlish is a creole language of English. It developed in Singapore in the 1970s after it gained independence, first from British colonial rule and later from merger with Malaysia. It mixes English introduced to Singapore by British settlers and later British colonial masters during the colonial period, and the mother tongues of then settlers in Singapore. Malay, the mother tongue of the locals, Tamil, the largest dialect group of the Indian settlers, and Mandarin as well as Hokkien, etc. The various Chinese dialect groups. I will first start by talking about how English was first introduced to Singapore. This will be coupled by some background information about how life was like under British colonial rule. The British first arrived in Southeast Asia in the late 1700s, eager to secure trade interests and a stake in the spice trade. They were faced with fierce competition from other European powers, such as, notably, the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish. In 1819, the British first landed on Singaporean shores. They were led by Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles. In the early 1900s, the British set up institutes of higher learning, with the medium of education and instruction being English. This is when English first started to become really popularized in Singapore. In 19 September 1963, it was the end of British colonial rule. The British colonial period had drawn to a close, and it was the beginning of Singapore's new chapter. Now, why did the British choose to come to Singapore? Singapore was just a little red dot on the end of the Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia. However, the British chose Singapore to thwart growing Dutch influence in the region and to protect British trade interests, so that they were not subject to the whim and fancy of the Dutch. The British already had two ports in Southeast Asia, Penang and Bencoolen. However, they were both not of a geographical location that was beneficial enough or advantageous enough for the British for them to use it as often as they later did Singapore. Singapore's good geographical location along the British trade route between India and China was also another key point for the British arrival in Singapore. Singapore had a sheltered harbour naturally formed by the mouth of the Singapore River, which was also an ideal condition for a port. What's more, it was a free port, which would easily attract more booming business and a lot of traders to come to Singapore. Now, how did the British take over Singapore? It is worthy of note that at the point in time, Singapore was still under the rule of the Johor Sultanate. Sir Stamford Raffles, the leader of the British Regiment, was the Lieutenant Governor of Bencoolen and agent of the British East India Company. In 1819, he negotiated a treaty with the Temenggung for Britain to set up a trading port in Singapore, and he named the island Singapore, after its ancient name Singapura. The origin of the name Singapura originates from a legend. about a Malay prince, Sang-Nila Utama. When he first arrived in this island, he saw a flash of gold. He asked his advisors what it was, and they answered, "A lion, sir." And so, even though, with current technology and knowledge, we know that Singapore does not, in fact, have any lions, and what he saw might have, in fact, been a tiger, he still named the place Singapura, or Lion City, after the presumed lion that he saw. Now, back to the British. In 1824, the Dutch formally recognized British control of Singapore, and Singapore was ruled by the British as part of the Strait Settlements. In 1867, the Strait Settlements, and Singapore along with it, became a crown colony, with Penang as its capital. This crown colony of the Strait Settlements was then ruled directly from London. Now, how was education like under the British? English education in Singapore, as the schools were mainly set up by missionaries and they charged extremely exorbitant school fees, only an educated elite spoke English, as they had to be extremely wealthy to be able to afford such private education. In 1823, Sir Stamford Raffles set up Singapore Institution. It is now known as Raffles Institution, and it is still, of course, having English as its medium of instruction and education. There were three main types of schools in Singapore under the British rule: English schools, Malay schools, which were free and had subsidized school fees by the British, as well as Chinese and Tamil schools. These schools were mainly set up by their own respective communities. Now, what about the languages that were not English? How did they fare under British rule? Ethnic enclaves were formed in Singapore under the influence of the Raffles Town Plan. When Sir Stamford Raffles arrived in Singapore, he drew up a town plan which segregated the different ethnic groups from each other. This made it so that people of their own communities would stick together, form closer bonds, and hence also ethnic enclaves. This also meant there was a reduced chance of them interacting and properly having relations with any other ethnic enclaves or groups of communities. As such, immigrants from different countries mainly stuck to their own people, and these tight-knit communities often gathered together to raise funds, for example, the Chinese and Tamil schools, with the medium of instruction being, of course, Chinese and Tamil. Now, Singlish is also made up of many different Chinese dialects, and Chinese is also the largest and majority ethnic group in Singapore. Now, what is the story of the Chinese immigrants? Sorry about that. Before the British came, there were already Chinese settlers in Singapore. From as early as the 10th century, there was evidence of Chinese people trading and settling in Singapore. In imperial Chinese sources, early records of Singapore named it as Long Yamen, which meant Dragon Tooth Gate, or Dan Ma Si, which we now know as Temasek. Other names for Singapore, such as Shi Le Po, could refer to Singapore, but some also argue that it refers to Singapore as well as the area around it. Through several archaeological excavations, several Chinese coins and ceramics have been found in Singapore, and the style of them has dated back to the Song dynasty. And from the 15th to 18th centuries, right before the British came to Singapore, some Peranakan Chinese from Malacca and Riau permanently settled in Singapore. They are known as the first groups of ethnic Chinese to first properly settle in Singapore. Under British rule, there was a Chinese majority. It was the dominant ethnic group in the 1830s, at 45.9% of the population, and then became the majority, more than 70% of the population, by 1901. It has stayed the way ever since, and up to today in Singapore, Chinese is still the majority ethnic group. The first Chinese settlers that came to Singapore were predominantly males. Due to societal attitudes such as that the man should be the main breadwinner, or rather the sole breadwinner, and that the woman should stay at home taking care of the family and the home, males that left their homes in China to come to Singapore were either single or they had their wife and children already, and they had left them at home. However, these settlers were often not permanent settlers. Once they had finished their contracts or earned enough money, they would then go back home to China, to their family, and to their kids. The first permanent settlers in Singapore were around the 1920s. Immigrants began settling in Singapore, staying even after their contracts ended and after they had earned enough money. Due to a shift in societal attitudes and letting women become more open and going out into the eye of the public, the sex ratio in Singapore also began evening out. And the Chinese in Singapore worked as in plantations or in the coolie trade. They were attracted by booming commerce, which required a large workforce and a lot of manual labor. The Chinese coolie trade was a trade of manual, unskilled laborers who did hard labor for often very little pay and worked for long hours. There are many Chinese languages in Singapore because the Chinese people from all different parts of China all spoke the language of their hometown. The Straits Chinese, who were the English educated, upper class, and wealthy, saw themselves often as more refined with the British than with the local Chinese communities. However, they were still able to speak Mandarin, their mother tongue. The Chinese educated Chinese, however, normally spoke little to no English. They spoke Mandarin as well as their own dialects. The own dialects of the different dialect groups are often almost mutually unintelligible. Although some meanings are often able to be discerned in between the communicators of different Chinese languages, it is often difficult to discern the complete meaning, and so there were many misunderstandings that arose from this. There were, and still are, 5 main Chinese dialect groups in Singapore: Hokkien, Teochew, Cantonese, Hakka, and Hainanese. For example, I am a member of the Hainanese Toplet group. Now, the locals in Singapore are the Malays. As such, Malay is considered our local language. In pre-British times, there were a couple of Malay subgroups in Singapore. The Orang Laut, for example, or the people of the sea, lived at sea in their boats. However, they were a bit different from the Malays in the sense that the indigenous Malays lived on the island in settlements. At that point, Singapore was part of the Johor Sultanate and was under the rule of a Temenggung. These indigenous Malays were about 100 to 120 of them, and only comparatively 30 Chinese, though we now know that the ethnic ratio changed later on. Under the British, many Malays worked in the British uniformed services. However, they were not permanent settlers in Singapore because many of them returned to Malaysia once their contracts had ended. The British funded Malay schools, and hence many Malay students had completely free education. They were and still are the second largest ethnic group in Singapore, now making up about 15% of the population. And now the Indian languages. There were many immigrants from India, and they served about the same kinds of jobs and purposes as the immigrants from China. For the different Indian Toplet groups, there were the vast majority, the Tamil Toplet group. Then, about 30% of them were Bengali, Hindustani, Telugu, etc. And the last 20% were then other dialect groups again. Malayali, Punjabi, Gujarati, etc. Now, Tamil is offered in Singapore as a mother tongue, and the rest are offered as well, but only in select educational institutions, such as the Ministry of Education Language Centre, where students of these Indian dialect groups can take them as a second language, although they will have to attend lessons outside of school time. Now, under British rule, the settlement and migration of Indian settlers increased from 1819 to World War II, as the Indian contact increased as well. Both India and Singapore were British colonies at the time. While Singapore was more used as a trading port, India was used for textiles as well as other trade interests that the British had at the time. The Indians, more than 80% of them worked as coolies. As mentioned before, these are uneducated, unskilled manual laborers. However, they were also extremely diverse along class lines. There were the white-collar workers as well as the educated elite. Then there was the mercantile class as well as the lowest, the working class. The hierarchy of these classes would be the educated elite, the mercantile classes, white-collar workers, and the working class. The top would be those who already are extremely wealthy, extremely well educated, and often very well English speaking. Next would be merchants. Although they are also extremely wealthy, they are significantly less well educated than the topmost class, and hence held in significantly lower regard. White-collar workers included jobs such as that of teachers. And lastly, more than 80% of them, the working class, coolies, uneducated, and engaging in manual labor. The Indians also had many reasons for coming to Singapore. There was a lot of unrest and instability in India at the time, with wars and famines plaguing the people. In search of a better life, they came to Singapore, looking to be able to find somewhere else to settle and hopefully be able to start a new and better life there for themselves and their family. Some of them were also convicts, serving their sentences in Singapore. After they helped the British in building their infrastructure, a lot of them stayed in Singapore after their sentences had finished. And lastly, Singapore achieved independence. Not only independence from British colonial rule, but also independence after the merger with Malaysia did not work out. Main parts of this would be the bilingualism policy, as well as the eventual development of Singlish as the language of the streets. The Prime Minister's office on 1 October 1965 once said, "In Singapore, 4 languages, Malay, Chinese, Tamil, and English, are official and equal languages. Malay is our common language and it is our national language." Okay, so we achieved independence. English was determined to be the lingua franca because of its economic value. The government thought that it was extremely important for Singapore to be able to keep in touch with and communicate with other English-speaking, politically and economically important powers of the world. Malay is our national language due to our previous merger with Malaysia, as well as due to the fact that we used to be under the rule of Malaysia and the Johor Sultanate, even further back. It is also our ceremonial language. It is used in the national anthem, Majulah Singapura, which means Onward Singapore. And it is also used to give commands in the military, such as parade commands on important parades such as our National Day Parade. Tamil was chosen as another one of the 4 official languages, as it was the biggest Indian dialect group by far. And Mandarin was selected to unify Singaporean Chinese from different Topolec groups. From people who used to stay with the people of their own hometown in their own different, separate little communities. This is considered to have separated them. And Mandarin, given that it was considered to have more economic and cultural value than Hokkien, which was the main language that most of the Chinese community spoke at the time, was chosen to be Singapore's 4th and last official language. The government had also stated that Mandarin had more values, that the structure of Mandarin as a language had more cultural heritage and cultural value in it that most of the different Topolec groups could identify with and could feel that that was part of their culture. And hence, this was supposed to help unify Chinese Singaporeans as one community. This is our founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. His bilingualism policy ensured that in 1987, all vernacular schools were closed. This is to say that the schools in Singapore no longer taught in the different Chinese dialects, but instead a bilingualism education system was incorporated. All schools in Singapore then and now still provide bilingual education, English and the mother tongue language of whatever ethnic group that you are part of. All Singaporeans are then encouraged to be proficient in English as well as their mother tongue language. This is so that in the future economic world, Singapore would have more options, more friends, and more opportunities to communicate well and have good relations with other countries. Given Singapore's small size, it is extremely important for us to maintain beneficial and cordial international relations with other countries, and the government also felt that Singaporeans being able to speak 2 languages fluently would be able to have an edge in the career industry next time. Apologies. To further stamp out the different varieties of Chinese dialects, the Speak Mandarin campaign was launched. It was launched in 1979. It was to encourage the use of Mandarin over Hokkien, the lingua franca of the Chinese community at the time. The Singaporean Chinese used to speak mutually unintelligible dialects, and even though they did speak Mandarin, more often than not, they would still revert to their hometown languages as that was more comfortable for them. Mandarin served as a means to unify the Singaporean Chinese. The Speak Mandarin campaign was extremely successful. It reduced the use of dialects a lot, to the extent that at the present moment, younger Singaporeans often only know how to speak Mandarin and not very well speak or understand their own Topolec group's dialect. However, Hokkien especially is still spoken by many today, though it is mainly spoken as a part of Singlish, and it is not spoken completely in its own language. And while all this was happening, what happened to Singlish? Prolonged language contact between speakers of English, Malay, Tamil, and different Chinese dialects produced Singlish. It evolved mainly among the working class. They spoke English, yes, but only a little bit. They had little English education and often mixed in elements of their own mother tongue. If they did not know how to express something in English, they simply replaced the word with a word from their own mother tongue, whether it be Malay, Tamil, or different Chinese dialects, especially Hokkien. This is why Hokkien has an exceptionally high percentage of the vocabulary in Singlish today. Children then acquired Singlish through a process called creolization, where instead of acquiring a pure form of Hokkien, for example, or Cantonese, or Tamil, or English, they instead acquired a mix of all this, Singlish. Singlish then became the language of the streets, because people would communicate with each other in Singlish. As often, it was difficult for them to communicate with each other in their mother tongues or in English due to the poor literacy rates at the time. And now, what does Singlish look like in modern-day Singaporean society? Here, we will talk a little bit more about what Singlish's significance is, different perspectives towards Singlish, and what we should do to continue preserving Singlish. Now, does the government like Singlish? Well, the short answer is no. The long answer is, they launched the Speak Good English campaign, where various governments of Singapore have declared Singlish as an obstacle to communication with the wider English-speaking world. Because although Singlish is absolutely easy to understand for other Singaporeans and speakers of Singlish, English speakers who are not from Singapore, born and raised in Singapore, or have only stayed in Singapore for a short amount of time will basically not be able to understand Singlish at all. Schools and media institutions are also using standard Singapore English as mandated by the government, with the only exception being media institutions having interviews in which the interviewee only speaks Singlish. However, the use of Singlish still remains widespread outside of official institutions. In English classrooms, for example, you might not see Singaporeans speaking to each other in Singlish, but the moment the bell rings, students immediately ask each other, "Hey, what are we gonna eat ah?" Which is an extremely good example of how Singlish is often used in daily life, because Singaporeans simply feel more comfortable speaking Singlish with their counterparts, their peers, their family, and their loved ones. But Singlish also has another purpose, which is to appeal to the locals. Many advertisements, for example, the KFC one on the right here, use Singlish as a means of appealing to the largest Singaporean community, to ignite a sense of community and togetherness. This is so that Singaporeans will be able to pay more attention to this advertisement, for example, and find joy in the fact that Singlish is being represented as well. Now, there's widespread use of Singlish in the streets and in our daily life. Almost all Singaporeans speak Singlish, whether now or at some point in their lives. Singlish connects Singaporeans with a sense of home. For example, when we are overseas, we might be speaking to someone who is in front of or behind us in a queue. Now, the accent might sound a little bit familiar, but what really gave it away was the particles that seemed to not mean anything. "Hey, I don't want to eat this lah." You mean you don't want to eat this lah? Wow, the la at the back is something that is extremely Singaporean, and is also an essential, famous part of Singlish. The realization that someone else is also a Singaporean manages to connect us with people from our hometown and homeland, even though we might be millions of meters away from home. And Singlish serves as the bridge that links us and connects our community together. Many jokes or sayings that might be considered inside jokes by Singaporeans too, and only Singaporeans can understand, are also made in Singlish, or with some elements of Singlish at least. When we speak Singlish, we not only speak our own mother tongue, English, but also mother tongues that are not our own. When I speak English, I speak Malay, I speak Tamil, and although I am Hainanese, I speak Hokkien, I speak Cantonese, and I speak Teochew. This shows how Singlish is a representation and a reflection of the extremely vibrant and diverse tapestry of the different ethnic groups and the different communities in Singapore. This is exactly why it has such impact and significance in today's society. It has immense cultural significance, as it is one of our best representations of how Singapore has come so far. Regardless of race or religion, we have managed to come together as one united people. United not only by our will for Singapore to continue prospering and flourishing, but also because we are one Singapore, one people, and we all speak Singlish. It is representative of our racial and cultural diversity, and shows the beauty that arises from the differences between peacefully coexisting communities in Singapore. This balance that we have achieved between the different racial communities is really extremely valuable, as this really shows how even though we are all so different, we can still make something extremely beautiful out of it. Hence, we should then encourage the speaking of Singlish. Singlish is extremely important to our heritage, our culture, and our identity. And given that Singaporean adults' English proficiency is second in the world, this is a statistic from 2022, Singlish does not, in fact, hinder the learning of standard English. The average Singaporean adult speaks English, and the average Singaporean adult also speaks perfect standard Singaporean English when needed. And hence, Singlish should be carefully preserved so that it may continue to develop and prosper. It would be a shame if Singaporeans were to no longer speak Singlish in the future. This is why, contrary to what the government and some official institutions are pushing for, I firmly believe that Singlish should be preserved. It is an integral part of our culture and our identity. It is the link that links Singaporeans together and the glue that holds our society so tightly knit. Singlish is just like the Singapore River that flows through Singapore. It flows through all of us, and through language, it has allowed us to form bonds, forge bonds, form connections, and build together a stronger Singapore, a stronger together, and a stronger sense of community. Additionally, Singlish has also been studied by linguists inside and outside of Singapore. They have acknowledged Singlish being able to stand by itself as a language. It has its own grammar and it has its own vocabulary. Instead of a half-fledged pidgin language, a poor half-baked excuse for English, it is in fact going to, with given a little bit more time, able to develop into its own mature language. I look forward to the day that it will be able to stand by itself, acknowledged by Singaporeans and others on the global stage as a language, worthy of being a language in its own right. And it is my dream that one day Singlish will also become the 5th official language of Singapore. Apologies. For more information about Singlish, such as how you can learn about it, where you can learn about it, and other interesting tips and tricks to learn Singlish, you may refer to my talk made at Polyglot Conference Global 2022 and International Mother Tongue Language Day 2022. Singlish, language at its most efficient. In this talk, I talk about how Singlish can express a lot of meanings in only a couple of syllables. This is what sets Singlish apart from other languages, English especially, and even though Singlish is a portmanteau word from English and Singapore, it is not English. Instead, Singlish is a representation and a condensation of the true meaning of Singapore. Here are the references that I have used in today's speech. Thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions about Singlish, do feel free to contact me at polyglotclubsg@gmail.com, our email, drop us a private message at polyglotclubsg, our Instagram, or you can fill in the contact us form at polyglotclubsg.com, our website. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope that today's talk has allowed you to learn more about Singlish and ignited your passion and hopefully your interest for learning Singlish as well. Thank you, and I hope to see you again next year.